friend Udi alone. While he was in a taxi near Union Square, here in Manhattan, he engaged in a conversation with the Muslim driver who tried to convince him that the attacks were a Jewish plot, of course, referring to the well-known rumors that that no Jews died there since they were secretly informed a day before not to go to the Twin Towers. Udi, my friend, immediately, of course, told the driver to stop and stepped out. But what he then encountered when walking across Union Square was a group of Orthodox Jews trying to mobilize their followers. One of them was, as it were, preaching to others, saying that we have now a new ultimate proof that God is protecting the Jewish people. No Jews were killed in the... So my friend was kind of perplexed by these strange bedfellows. This is how opposites coincide in our daily lives. So how does God fit into all this? Let me begin with a well-known quote from Dostoevsky, and as the joke goes, but in this case the joke is literally true. This is a quote from Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky just never said this. If there is no God, then everything is permitted. As far as I was able to establish, the first one to attribute this to Dostoevsky was Sartre in 1943 in his letter Le Néant. Allegedly, Dostoevsky said this to Brothers Karamazov, he doesn't say. But okay, it does render his insight in some way. Conservatives like to evoke this thought: if there is no God, then everything is permitted. Apropos scandals among the atheist hedonist elite, from millions killed in Gulag up to animal sex and gay marriages, here is, so they say, where we end if we deny all transcendent authority which poses some unsurpassable limits to human endeavors. Without such limits, so the story goes, there is no ultimate obstacle to exploiting one's neighbors ruthlessly, to use them as tools for profit and pleasure, to enslave and humiliate them, even to kill them in millions. All that separates us from this ultimate moral vacuum are, in the absence of a higher transcendent limit, temporary and non-obligatory pacts among wolves, self-imposed limitations in the interest of one's survival and well-being, which can be violated at any moment. But I would like to begin with this naive question: are things really like that? Well, the first thing one cannot help noticing is that Jacques Lacan's well-known critical inversion of this Dostoevsky's dictum, Lacan inverted it into, if there is no God, then everything is prohibited. This inversion is much more appropriate to describe the universe of atheist liberal hedonists. They dedicate their life to the pursuit of pleasures, but since there is no external authority which would guarantee them a space for this pursuit, they get entangled into a thick network of self-imposed politically correct regulations, as if a superego much more severe than that of the traditional morality is controlling them. They get obsessed by the idea that in pursuing their pleasures, they may humiliate or violate others' space, so they regulate their behavior with detailed prescriptions about how to avoid harassing others, not to mention the no less complex regulation of their own care of the self, bodily fitness, health, food, spiritual relaxation, and so on. Indeed, nothing is more oppressive and regulated than being a simple hedonist. The simple thing, strictly correlative to this first observation, is that today it is rather those who refer to God in a brutally direct way, perceiving themselves as direct instruments of God's will. It is rather to them that everything is permitted. It is the so-called fundamentalists who practice a perverted version of what Kierkegaard called the religious hegemonic ideology calls on us to enjoy life and to realize our inner selves, it is difficult for the majority to overcome their revulsion and torturing and killing another human being. The large majority of people are, thanks God, spontaneously moral. Torturing or killing another human being is deeply traumatic for most of us. So in order to make them do it, a larger sacred cause is needed, which makes petty individual concerns about killing seem trivial. Religion or ethnic belonging or art, poetry fits this role perfectly. This is my old thesis, that literally, behind every ethnic cleansing there is a poet. It's not only a courage, but not religion. Of course, there are cases of pathological atheists who are able to commit mass murder just for pleasure, just for the sake of it. But I think they are rare exceptions. The majority needs to be anesthetized against their elementary decency and sensitivity for the other's suffering. Again, for this, a sacred cause is needed. Without this cause, we would have to feel all the burden of what we did, with no absolute on whom to put the ultimate responsibility. Religious ideologies usually claim that, true or not, religion makes some otherwise bad people to do some good things. From today's experience, one should rather speak to Stephen Weinberg, to his claim that while without religion, good people would have been doing good things and bad people bad things, only religion can make good people do bad things. But I'm far from, as you will see, of course, condemning religion. No less important. The same, another critical point, also seems to hold for the display of so-called human weaknesses. Isolated, extreme forms of sexuality among godless hedonists are immediately elevated into representative symbols of the depravity of the goddess. While any questioning of, say, the link between the much more massive phenomenon of priests, pedophilia, and the church as institution, Catholic Church, is rejected as anti-religious slander. The well-documented story of how the Catholic Church as institution protects pedophilia in its own ranks is another good example of how, if God exists, then everything is permitted to those who legitimize themselves as his servants. What makes this protective attitude towards pedophilia so disgusting is that it is not practiced by tolerant hedonists, but to add insult to injury by the very institution which poses as the moral guardian of society. Now you will say, and I agree with this immediate counter-question, but what about the Stalinist communist mass killings? What about the extra-legal liquidations of the nameless millions in the Soviet Union? But I think it is easy to see how these crimes were always justified by their own ersatz God, a God that failed, as Ignazio Silone, one of the great disappointed communists, called it. They had their own God, which is why everything was permitted then. In other words, the same logic as that of religious violence applies here. Stalinist communists do not perceive themselves as hedonist individuals abandoned to their freedom. No, they perceive themselves as instruments of historical progress, of a higher necessity which pushes humanity towards next stage of communism. And it is this reference to their own absolute and to their own privileged relationship to this absolute, which permits them to do whatever they want or consider necessary. This is why the moment threats appear in this ideological protective shield, the way of what they